October 14th, 1962. 72,000 feet above San Cristobal, Cuba. The sky above was a bruise-deep indigo, a vacuum so thin and cold it was indistinguishable from the blackness of space. Inside the cramped cockpit of the Lockheed U-2, Major Richard Hazer, callsign Oilstone, fought a persistent, bone-deep shiver. He wasn't wearing a bulky flight suit. Rather, he was sealed into a custom-fitted full-pressure suit, a cumbersome, orange survival garment that made every movement feel like an underwater chore. The air hissed gently around his helmet seal, the only sound apart from the rhythmic whine of the Pratt and Whitney J-57 P-37 jet engine spooling out an impossible 11,000 pounds of thrust. The aircraft itself was a bizarre contradiction, a delicate, almost glider-like airframe married to a powerful fighter engine, its vast, straight wings spanning 80 feet to catch the whisper of air at this impossible altitude. For months, the only confirmed enemy radar signature that Hazer and his fellow pilots had been warned about had originated from Soviet U-2 guideline surface-to-air missile batteries, missiles the Soviets had publicly claimed could reach 100,000 feet. But the U.S. intelligence community had scoffed at this claim. The CIA's most reliable estimations put the SA-2's effective ceiling far below 75,000 feet. Hazer had been briefed to fly the very edge of the flight envelope, maintaining a perilous balance between the coffin corner of the U-2's aerodynamics, where a slight speed reduction would cause a high-altitude stall and a slight speed increase would cause mock tuck and structural failure. The mission, codenamed Operation Brass Knob, was simple: to fly from the forward operating base at Edwards Air Force Base in California, refuel at McCoy Air Force Base in Orlando, Florida, and penetrate Cuban airspace. Beneath the U-2's fuselage, securely bolted to the camera bay, was the Hycon 73-inch camera system, a marvel of engineering weighing 200 pounds, capable of resolving objects as small as 2.5 feet from this staggering height. Its film magazines held thousands of feet of high-resolution film, its shutter poised to capture the undeniable truth of what was transpiring on the island nation below. Hazer adjusted his course, the autopilot maintaining a perfect north-to-south track over the Cuban landscape, the island's coastline a clear, sun-drenched relief map far, far beneath his feet. He began the photographic runs, the camera silently whirring to life, its massive lens focused on the western province of Pinar del Rio. The objective was singular: to confirm the persistent but unverified reports of Soviet nuclear warheads and their delivery systems. This was the moment the U.S. had been waiting for, the confrontation that had been years in the making, the final proof that would either dismiss the paranoia of the Cold War or catapult the world to its terrifying brink. The true roots of Major Hazer's solitary flight lay years earlier, in the anxious, paranoid heart of the 1950s, a time when the strategic balance of power hinged entirely on knowing the enemy's capabilities. Washington, D.C. was obsessed with the bomber gap, the terrifying prospect that the Soviet Union was outpacing the U.S. in long-range jet bomber production. The only reliable means of verifying this was through photographic reconnaissance. Yet every existing aircraft, the B-47, the B-52, even the fastest fighters, flew too low, well within the effective envelope of Soviet anti-aircraft artillery and the new generation of MiG interceptors. The CIA, under Director Allen Dulles, issued an almost impossible requirement: a spy plane that could fly consistently and reliably above 65,000 feet, an altitude then considered unreachable for sustained flight, and possess a range capable of traversing the vast Soviet landmass. This was a direct challenge flung to the aerospace industry. The response came, improbably, from a tiny, intensely secretive division of Lockheed known as Skunk Works, led by the legendary engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson. Johnson, a man known for getting things done quickly and outside the conventional bureaucratic chains, took on the project designated Project Aquatone. He understood that altitude was the only defense. At 70,000 feet, The air density was so low that conventional jet aircraft would stall, and the G-forces required for a pursuing fighter to maneuver would instantly cause it to flame out. Johnson's design philosophy was ruthless weight saving. The resulting aircraft was officially the Lockheed CL-281, later christened the U-2 for utility two. It was unlike any jet built before. It utilized extremely light, almost sailplane-like wings, with a high aspect ratio, designed for maximum lift in thin air. Every unnecessary component was stripped away. The landing gear was simplified and almost comically flimsy. The plane couldn't even taxi normally and relied on detachable pogos, small outrigger wheels, for takeoff, which dropped away once airborne. Landing was a terrifying, delicate balancing act, guided by a high-speed chase car on the ground. The engine was the powerful but temperamental Pratt & Whitney J57, adapted specifically for high-altitude operation. Crucially, the 73-inch camera bay in the fuselage was not an afterthought. It was the heart of the design, dictating the plane's size and shape. The entire concept was an audacious gamble. Trade speed and maneuverability for sheer altitude, betting that Soviet technology simply couldn't touch the edge of space. For 4 years, from the initial contract in 1954 to its operational deployment, the U-2 was shrouded in secrecy, tested at a desolate, unmarked location in the Nevada desert known only by its official designation, Watertown, a place that would soon earn the moniker Area 51. This delicate, high-flying ghost was born of necessity, an immediate answer to a profound intelligence vacuum, and its first, deeply provocative missions would soon define a decade of Cold War espionage. The isolated expanse of the Nevada desert, specifically a dry lake bed known as Groom Lake, became the birthplace of the U-2's operational life. In 1955, this remote location, later infamously dubbed Area 51, was nothing more than a rudimentary airstrip and a handful of prefabricated buildings. It was chosen precisely for its inaccessibility and the vast, empty airspace above it, ideal for test flights of an aircraft that could reach heights no other plane had ever sustained. Under the command of Richard M. Bissell Jr., a brilliant but controversial CIA operative, the base at Groom Lake became a hive of intense, covert activity. The security was absolute, the perimeter patrolled by armed guards, and access restricted to an elite cadre of engineers, technicians, and a hand-picked group of pilots. These pilots were not ordinary aviators. They were drawn from the ranks of the Air Force's most experienced test pilots, men with thousands of hours in high-performance jets, but they had to possess a unique blend of calm under pressure, meticulous attention to detail, and a solitary temperament. Flying the U-2 was an inherently lonely endeavor. Missions could last up to 9 hours, often crossing international datelines, with only the hum of the engine and the crackle of a distant radio for company. The physical demands were immense. Pilots had to wear the full-pressure suit, which, while essential for survival at altitude, was restrictive and uncomfortable. Decompression sickness was a constant threat. Moreover, the aircraft itself was notoriously difficult to fly. Its immense wings, so efficient at altitude, made it prone to adverse yaw at lower speeds, and its delicate construction meant it could easily be overstressed. The first U-2 prototype, known internally as Article 341, made its maiden flight on August 4, 1955. Lockheed test pilot Tony Levier was at the controls, taking off from the dusty, sun-baked runway of Groom Lake. The early flights were fraught with challenges. The engine, originally designed for lower-altitude bombers, had a tendency to flame out in the thin upper atmosphere, requiring harrowing glide descents and emergency restarts. The specialized cameras, developed by Hycon and Perkin-Elmer, also required constant calibration and refinement. Every test flight pushed the boundaries of aviation, collecting invaluable data not just on the aircraft's performance, but on the very nature of high-altitude flight, meteorology, and the physiological effects on humans at the edge of space. The sight of the U-2 against the deep blue sky, often leaving faint contrails at altitudes where no other aircraft could, was a stark testament to its revolutionary design. It was a ghost in the sky, an ethereal presence that moved with unsettling grace. By late 1955 and into 1956, the program moved from developmental testing to operational readiness. The initial pilots, including future Major Richard Hazer's predecessors, underwent rigorous training, simulating long-duration missions and perfecting the delicate art of landing the unique aircraft. The CIA was eager. The bomber gap was still a pressing concern, and the U-2, this silent sentinel, was now ready to provide the definitive answers Washington desperately sought. Its deployment would not be over friendly skies, but deep within the closely guarded borders of the Soviet Union itself, an act of calculated provocation masked by the absolute secrecy of its origin and capabilities. The world was about to get a very unwelcome visitor. The CIA had achieved the technological marvel. Now came the operational and political tightrope walk. The first operational U-2 squadron, designated Detachment A, later Det G, was secretly deployed to Wiesbaden Air Base in West Germany in 1956, placing them within range of the Western Soviet Union. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, acutely aware that these missions were acts of war that could easily trigger global conflict, approved the flights with intense personal scrutiny and immense trepidation. He authorized the missions on a week-by-week, sometimes day-by-day basis. The justification was rooted in the absolute necessity of eliminating the intelligence blind spot over the USSR. The inaugural mission over Soviet territory, codenamed Operation OVI, took place on July 4, 1956. Pilot Harvey Stockman flew from Wiesbaden, penetrating the Soviet airspace at 68,000 feet. His target, the Soviet naval yards at Leningrad and the strategically vital submarine pens near the Baltic Sea. The entire world held its breath, though only a handful of people in Washington knew the plane was airborne. Stockman's flight was a resounding success. He flew for hours deep into the Soviet interior, capturing thousands of high-resolution images. The photographs, once developed and analyzed, immediately demolished the myth of the bomber gap. Analysts discovered that the supposed massive fleet of Soviet long-range bombers, the Myasishchev for Bison, was far smaller and less potent than fear-mongering estimates had suggested. The U-2 had just saved the United States billions of dollars in unnecessary military expenditure and, more importantly, calmed a burgeoning domestic panic. The success was intoxicating, but the very act of the flight had been detected. Soviet PVO Strany, Air Defense Forces, radar stations picked up the faint, high-altitude echo. General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev was immediately informed of the intrusion. His generals were apoplectic. They had been penetrated at will by a single, high-flying plane they couldn't reach. The Soviets scrambled their fastest available MiG-17s and later the supersonic MiG-19s, but to no avail. The fighters could barely reach 50,000 feet and, even with afterburners screaming, could not gain enough altitude to pose a threat. They would briefly see the U-2's vapor trail, a distant line of white against the deep blue, before their engines faltered in the thin air, forcing them into sharp descent. The Soviets filed a diplomatic protest, a vague complaint about unidentified aircraft, which the U.S. government coolly dismissed. The strategy was working. The Soviets knew they were being spied upon, but they possessed no viable means to stop it. This technological asymmetry created a window of unprecedented intelligence gathering for the CIA. Over the next 4 years, U-2s flew dozens of increasingly bold missions, photographing ICBM launch sites, nuclear weapons production facilities, and troop movements. With every successful mission, the U.S. grew more confident, and the Soviet frustration boiled hotter. This period of unchallenged dominance would lead to a dangerous overconfidence on the American side and, crucially, a furious determination in Moscow to close the lethal altitude gap. In the Kremlin, the constant stream of American U-2 overflights was less a strategic disaster and more a profound, personal humiliation for Nikita Khrushchev. The general secretary was a man of volatile temper, and the successful incursions, which he privately referred to as spitting from on high, made him look weak to the powerful hardliners within the Presidium and, perhaps more importantly, to the Soviet people. Publicly, Moscow adopted a stance of mocking contempt. Soviet propaganda, carefully disseminated through state-run media, often dismissed the U-2 as an antiquated, lumbering relic. They sarcastically dubbed the U-2 the Black Crow, or, more dismissively, a flying tank, implying it was slow, vulnerable, and easily swat down should the need arise. The official line was that the American spy plane flew high only because it was too slow to evade Soviet interceptors at lower altitudes. This narrative was vital for maintaining the facade of Soviet technological parity or even superiority, which was the cornerstone of Khrushchev's domestic and international policy. However, behind the closed doors of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, the reality was grim. The Soviet PVO strainy forces were effectively blind above 55,000 feet. Their most advanced radar systems had trouble tracking the U-2's small, radar-absorbent fuselage in the thin air, and even when a track was confirmed, they had no weapon capable of engaging it. The best interceptors, like the MiG-19, were equipped with air-to-air missiles that were ineffective at the U-2's operating ceiling. The air crews themselves faced severe physiological limits. Pushing their aircraft into the stratosphere risked engine flameout and a sudden, lethal loss of cabin pressure. Khrushchev poured immense resources into two critical counterprograms. The first was the acceleration of the McCoy and Gurevich Design Bureau's high-altitude interceptor project, which would eventually yield the formidable MiG-25 Foxbat. The second, and more immediate hope, lay in the deployment of a new generation of sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems. Specifically, the SA-2 guideline, known to the Soviets as the S-75 Vina. This mobile, two-stage missile system was the technological key the Soviet Union needed. Its designers and operators, eager to redeem the military's honor, boasted that the SA-2 possessed an engagement ceiling of over 80,000 feet, well above the U-2's cruise altitude. For nearly 4 years, the U-2 retained its invulnerability, its camera systematically peeling back the layers of Soviet strategic deception. This streak of successful espionage bred a sense of invincibility within the CIA's operational directorate, a growing confidence that bordered on recklessness. The prevailing wisdom in Washington became that altitude was absolute defense. The very arrogance born of this success would set the stage for the dramatic, violent end of the U-2's honeymoon period, exposing the fragile nature of Cold War espionage to the entire world. The Soviet engineers, fueled by humiliation, were working desperately to make their boasts about the SA-2 a terrifying reality. The morning of May 1st, 1960, dawned cold and clear over Peshawar Air Station, Pakistan. Pilot Francis Gary Powers, a veteran U-2 aviator, strapped himself into the cockpit of his aircraft, Article 360. The mission, designated Operation Grand Slam, was one of the most ambitious yet, a deep penetration flight designed to photograph the Soviet ICBM test site at Baikonur Cosmodrome and the nuclear production facilities at Chelyabinsk 40. It was a defiant gesture, flown directly over Soviet territory on their sacred May Day national holiday. Powers ascended rapidly, settling into his cruise altitude of 70,500 feet. For hours, the mission proceeded like all the others, quiet, lonely, and seemingly untouchable. He successfully photographed his primary targets. However, unknown to Powers and the CIA command back in the United States, he was being tracked by a relentless network of SA-2 guideline missile batteries, mobilized and ready. Over the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, the silent, invisible moment of truth arrived. At approximately 8:53 a.m. local time, Powers heard and felt a massive, concussive jolt. It wasn't a direct hit. The SA-2 warhead, guided by improved Soviet radar systems, detonated in a brilliant, shrapnel-spewing burst hundreds of feet below and behind the U-2. The blast wave, even in the thin air, was catastrophic. The explosion tore off a large section of the aircraft's tail structure and violently ripped the long wings from the fuselage. Powers U-2 instantly tumbled into an uncontrollable high-altitude spin. The altimeter spun backward wildly as the pressure suit ballooned and the cabin depressurized. Powers fought the G-forces, struggling to operate the destruction switch that was meant to obliterate the aircraft and its photographic evidence. But the cockpit was already disintegrating around him. He was thrown clear of the wreckage, falling helplessly through the stratosphere. After a terrifying descent, he managed to deploy his parachute and landed roughly near the village of Casalino. He was quickly surrounded by bewildered Soviet farmers and soldiers. The Soviets had not only shot down the flying tank, but they had also captured the pilot alive, along with significant portions of the U-2's wreckage, including the still intact camera and film magazines. When news of a missing U-2 reached Washington, the CIA immediately initiated the pre-approved cover story. An unassigned NASA weather research plane had gone off course over Turkey after the pilot reported oxygen trouble. President Eisenhower, briefed on this deceptive narrative, used it to assure the world that no U.S. military or intelligence aircraft had violated Soviet airspace. Then, Nikita Khrushchev, seizing the moment for maximum global impact, delivered the crushing counterpunch. I must tell you a secret. When I made my first statement, I deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and safe. And now just look how many foolish things the Americans have said. The U.S. was caught in a brazen, humiliating lie. The incident collapsed the crucial Paris summit meant to ease Cold War tensions and forced Eisenhower to reluctantly suspend all further U-2 overflights over the Soviet Union. The high-altitude ghost was grounded, leaving a gaping hole in U.S. intelligence and setting the stage for the next, far more dangerous escalation. The U-2 shoot-down fundamentally altered the American political and intelligence landscape. The immediate, humiliating result was the paralysis of high-altitude reconnaissance. For the rest of 1960 and in 1961, the CIA was forced to rely on lower-altitude flights, human intelligence, and compromised signal intercepts, all vastly inferior to the clear, definitive photographs the U-2 had provided. This intelligence drought coincided with a crucial shift in American leadership, the inauguration of John F. Kennedy in January 1961. Kennedy, young and inexperienced on the world stage, inherited a Cold War landscape defined by aggressive Soviet posturing and escalating proxy conflicts. He was immediately tested by the charismatic and increasingly Soviet-aligned leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro. Castro's communist revolution, just 90 miles from Key West, was an intolerable geopolitical thorn for Washington. The CIA, still stinging from the powers debacle, desperately sought a quick victory to restore its credibility. This push led to the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. The plan, largely conceived under the Eisenhower administration, involved training and deploying a brigade of Cuban exiles to overthrow the Castro regime. Critically, the operation relied on compromised intelligence and a profound underestimation of Castro's military strength and popular support. Kennedy, fearful of overt American involvement and the potential for a larger war, authorized the landing but pulled back crucial promised air support at the last minute. The result was a catastrophic failure, with the invading forces quickly captured or killed. The Bay of Pigs was a double victory for Khrushchev. It demonstrated American incompetence and lack of resolve to the world, and it cemented the ideological and military alliance between Cuba and the Soviet Union. Castro, feeling vulnerable and deeply indebted to Moscow, now eagerly welcomed a stronger Soviet military presence to deter any future U.S. invasions. For Kennedy, the debacle was a baptism by fire, leading him to develop a deep and lasting skepticism toward the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA, particularly its director, Allen Dulles, whom he soon replaced. The critical consequence of this chain of events, the grounded U-2, the rise of Castro, and the Bay of Pigs humiliation, was the creation of a massive intelligence blind spot coupled with a critical need for Soviet protection in the Caribbean. Khrushchev viewed the Bay of Pigs as proof that Kennedy could be pushed and that a defensive move to secure Cuba was both necessary and possible. The stage was set for the Soviets to make an audacious, game-changing gambit, knowing the Americans lacked the technological high ground to see it coming until it was potentially too late. The absence of the U-2 was about to create the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. By the early summer of 1962, Nikita Khrushchev finalized his most aggressive and calculated Cold War strategy, the deployment of medium and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles, MRBMs and IRBMs, to Cuban soil. The operation was assigned the deceptively benign code name Operation Nadir, named after a river flowing into the Bering Sea, suggesting a routine military deployment to the icy Soviet Far East, miles away from the tropical Caribbean. Khrushchev's logic was threefold. First, it was a necessary defensive shield for Cuba, ensuring Castro's survival against what he viewed as inevitable future American invasion attempts. Second, and most importantly, it was a rapid, game-changing equalizer in the strategic nuclear balance. At the time, the U.S. possessed a significant advantage in intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and had already placed Jupiter MRBMs in Turkey, within striking distance of Moscow. Placing Soviet R-12 SS-4 and R-14 SS-5 missiles in Cuba effectively reversed this imbalance, giving the Soviets the ability to target nearly every major U.S. city east of the Rockies within minutes. The third objective was a political calculation, a direct challenge to the young President Kennedy, testing his resolve after the Bay of Pigs embarrassment. The sheer scale of Operation Nadir was staggering and demanded absolute operational secrecy. Beginning in July 1962, a flotilla of over 85 Soviet ships, freighters, tankers, and troop transports began moving personnel, equipment, and crucially, the nuclear components across the vast Atlantic. To maintain the deception, the missiles, launch equipment, and accompanying warheads, which traveled separately, were meticulously camouflaged. Crates were marked with labels like agricultural equipment or naval supplies. The 40,000 Soviet troops and technicians transported were issued winter clothing to reinforce the Siberia deception. They were not allowed on deck during daylight hours, enduring sweltering conditions below the waterline, and only emerged at night to carry out maintenance. Upon arrival in Cuba's ports like Mariel and La Isabela, the secrecy was maintained through intense security protocols. The missile components, long, cylindrical, and undeniably military, were moved primarily at night under heavy guard and quickly deployed to carefully selected sites in the Cuban countryside. Soviet engineers, working with feverish speed under the intense tropical sun, began clearing launch pads, constructing concrete missile shelters, and erecting the characteristic security perimeter fences. The deployment was an exercise in covert military precision, a race against time and the distant possibility of American detection. The U.S., relying on its standard photographic and signals intelligence, was looking for subtle shifts in global shipping traffic, but without the high-altitude, definitive overview of the U-2, the movement of individual pieces of hardware on the ground remained tragically obscured. Moscow felt certain that by the time the Americans fully realized the implications, the missiles would be operational, forcing the U.S. to accept the new strategic reality. While Soviet ships were unloading their lethal cargo in the stifling Cuban heat, the American intelligence community was swimming in a confusing deluge of conflicting, low-grade reports. The vacuum left by the suspended U-2 overflights was being filled by fragments of human intelligence, and less precise aerial reconnaissance from lower-flying U.S. Navy aircraft and Air Force RF-101 Voodoo jets. These planes were restricted to below 10,000 feet, making them vulnerable and only capable of capturing narrow, oblique views entirely different from the sweeping, high-resolution clarity of the U-2. Initial indicators were vague, but unsettling. Cuban exiles and agents operating on the island were sending back frantic, unverified reports of massive, fast-moving construction projects deep in the provinces of Pinar del Rio and Matanzas. They spoke of unusually large convoys moving at night, of foreign troops, and of vast, fenced-off areas guarded by soldiers who spoke no Spanish. One particularly vivid report described long, cylindrical objects being rapidly moved on trucks, hidden under canvas covers, a description that perfectly matched the R-12 missiles, but which the CIA's analysts in Washington struggled to confirm. The analytical community was deeply divided. The CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, initially dismissed many of the lower-altitude photos. They noted the increased presence of Soviet Se-2 anti-aircraft missile sites and MiG-21 fighters, but argued these were consistent with defensive measures designed to deter a conventional U.S. invasion following the Bay of Pigs. A logical, non-nuclear explanation. A powerful faction within the intelligence community, including key members of the Board of National Estimates, clung to the belief that Khrushchev would never be so reckless as to deploy offensive nuclear weapons outside the established Soviet sphere of influence. Placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, they argued, was a violation of all accepted Cold War norms and thus too politically irrational to consider. This skepticism created dangerous inertia. Despite increasing pressure from Congress and hawkish military leaders demanding proof of offensive weapons, the CIA could only offer inconclusive evidence of defensive installations. They had photographs of SAM sites, barracks, and new airfields, but nothing definitively pointing to the 40-foot-long ballistic missiles. The low-flying reconnaissance missions, besides being dangerous, were often subject to poor weather and the immediate threat of Cuban anti-aircraft fire, leading to blurry, unusable images. The crucial flaw in American intelligence was the lack of context, the ability to photograph a wide area simultaneously and compare the size and shape of objects with known Soviet hardware. Only the U-2, with its sweeping camera systems, could provide this definitive, indisputable context. As weeks turned into months through the late summer of 1962, the whispers grew louder, but the photographic evidence remained shrouded in shadows and ambiguity. Washington was operating on speculation, while Moscow, in stark contrast, was operating on fact, rapidly closing the deployment window before the Americans could fully connect the disparate dots. By late September 1962, the political atmosphere in Washington was approaching combustion. Republican senators and hawkish military leaders, fueled by the vague but persistent reports of a Soviet military buildup, publicly accused the Kennedy administration of being soft on communism and deliberately ignoring the Cuban threat. The president himself, while attempting to maintain a facade of calm, was deeply troubled by the contradictions in the intelligence reports. He had received direct assurances from Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko that no offensive weapons would be placed in Cuba, a commitment that now rang hollow against the background noise of refugee testimony and escalating photographic anomalies. The key figure pushing for definitive confirmation was John McCone, the newly appointed director of Central Intelligence. McCone, unlike many of his analysts, instinctively believed Khrushchev would deploy offensive missiles. He argued that the defensive concentration of SA-2 sites was not meant to protect a conventional buildup, but rather to create a high-altitude shield for a far more valuable asset, nuclear missiles. McCone relentlessly pressed the operational teams to get better photographic coverage, arguing that the low-level missions were insufficient and the risk of interception was worth the potential gain. The problem, however, was political, not technological. The U-2 had been grounded from overflying the Soviet Union since the Powers Incident, and while flights over other Soviet-aligned territories had occurred, flying directly over Cuba, a nation now bristling with S-2 batteries, was viewed by the State Department and some Pentagon officials as an unacceptable provocation. They feared that if a U-2 were shot down over Cuba, it would provide Castro and Khrushchev with a pretext to claim they were attacked, potentially triggering a military response from Moscow and dragging the U.S. into an immediate war. The debate came to a head in the first week of October. Analysts at NPIC identified a peculiar, highly organized clearing in one of the recent RF-101 photos, showing a distinct pattern that mirrored known Soviet missile launch sites in the USSR, a pattern too organized and specific to be just a troop encampment. This partial evidence, combined with the escalating political crisis, finally tipped the scales. On October 10, 1962, after agonizing deliberation, President Kennedy, overriding his more cautious advisors, gave the conditional green light. He authorized a single, high-risk U-2 mission over the western portion of Cuba, specifically targeting the areas where the most suspicious ground clearing had been reported. The mission was placed under the control of the Air Force's Strategic Air Command, SISI, rather than the CIA, to provide a layer of deniability should the plane be lost. The U-2 was about to fly again, a lone sentinel carrying the hopes and fears of the world on its enormous wings, aiming to pierce the final, lethal shroud of secrecy. The high-stakes mission was designated Mission 316. Responsibility for execution fell to the 4080th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, SAC, stationed temporarily at McCoy Air Force Base in Orlando, Florida. The air base, usually a staging area for bombers, transformed into an island of tense, silent urgency. Technicians swarmed over the sleek, black U-2 aircraft, specifically the one assigned to Major Richard Hazer. They meticulously checked the delicate skin of the wings, ensured the specialized low-volatility fuel was loaded precisely for maximum endurance, and, most critically, sealed the Hycon 73-inch camera system into its pressurized bay. The political decision to fly was an extraordinary roll of the dice. Intelligence officers and SAC commanders gathered for the pre-flight briefings, their faces etched with the pressure of the moment. They reviewed the fragmentary evidence, the suspicious clearing patterns, the construction activity, and superimposed them onto detailed map transparencies of Western Cuba. They acknowledged the documented presence of at least 6 functioning SA-2 guideline sites ringing the most vital areas. Yet, despite the painful lesson of Francis Gary Powers, the overwhelming military consensus was that the U-2 was still safe over Cuba. The official analysis presented to the pilots asserted that the Soviet SA-2 missiles were only effective up to approximately 75,000 feet. The 75,000 feet ceiling was the effective kill zone. Hazer was instructed to fly the aircraft's absolute ceiling, maintaining a minimum altitude of 72,000 feet. The pilots were told, with the certainty of institutional denial, that the Soviets had deployed the same standard SA-2s that had struggled to hit Powers' plane in 1960, and that only a perfect, impossible shot would pose a threat. The strategy was pure altitude: fly high, fly fast, and rely on the sheer height advantage that had protected the U-2 for years. In the hours before dawn on October 14, 1962, Major Hazer went through the complex preparations for a flight at the edge of the atmosphere. The most vital component was the sealing of the MC-3 full-pressure suit. Every zipper, every seal, every connection to the oxygen and cooling systems had to be perfect, as a suit failure at 72,000 feet meant instantaneous death. The process was slow, methodical, and profoundly isolating. By the time Hazer was ready, sealed into his helmet and visor, he could barely hear the hushed voices of his crew chiefs. Hazer was driven to the tarmac. The U-2, looking immense and spectral in the early morning light, was already idling, its single-jet engine radiating heat. The 2 technicians holding the wooden pogo wheels stood ready. There was no fanfare, no ceremony, just the cold weight of the mission. At 6 a.m. Eastern Time, Hazer released the brakes. The aircraft surged forward, and the auxiliary wheels dropped away. He climbed into the indigo sky, a silent, solitary ghost with a 73-inch lens pointed toward the undeniable truth. Major Richard Hazer wrestled the fragile U-2 into the stratosphere. The ascent was always the most technically demanding part of the flight, requiring precise management of fuel, thrust, and angle of attack. He had to climb quickly through the thick, turbulent air of the lower atmosphere, known to pilots as the weather, to reach the smooth, sanctuary-like calm of 70,000 feet. Hazer maintained his heading south-southeast from the Florida coast, tracking toward the thin line of the Cuban coastline rapidly growing on his windscreen. As he crossed the Florida Straits, the U-2 reached its designated cruise altitude of 72,000 feet. The sky outside was an ethereal gradient, fading from pale blue at the horizon to the perpetual black of space overhead. Hazer settled into the routine, his gloved hands making minute corrections to the flight's surfaces to maintain the narrow speed margin in the coffin corner. The silence was profound, broken only by the hum of the auxiliary equipment and the conscious sound of his own breathing through the oxygen mask. His body, encased in the bulky pressure suit, was isolated not just from the world, but from the airplane itself. His designated flight path was designed to cover the most suspect areas in the western Pinar del Rio province, specifically the areas designated San Cristobal and Sagua La Grande, where the intelligence whispers were loudest. Hazer activated the Hicon camera system, a simple mechanical click confirmed through a series of panel lights. The 73-inch focal length lens, its shutter opening and closing automatically based on the aircraft's speed and altitude, began its work, systematically mapping a 10-mile wide strip of Cuban earth below. Hazer was hyper-aware of the threat. The moment he crossed the coastline, he knew he was visible on the Cuban-Soviet radar screens. He peered down, straining to see any sign of the defensive network, the unmistakable star-pattern clearings of the U-2 sites that had been photographed previously. The irony was not lost on him. The Americans were flying a plane they knew the Soviets could hit, based on a 2-year-old failure, relying on an analytical presumption that Soviet technology hadn't improved. As the plane tracked over the San Cristobal region, Hazer noted several large, geometrically precise clearings in the dense vegetation, patterns unlike any normal Cuban construction. He recorded the time and location in his flight log, a small act of clerical duty performed with the full knowledge that what he was seeing represented a major military deployment. He completed his designated runs, banking gently for the return leg, ensuring the camera captured the necessary overlapping coverage. Hazer felt no immediate threat. There was no telltale smoke of a missile launch, no visual sign of an interceptor's contrail. The 4-hour surveillance window was complete, and he turned north, the precious film reels safely contained within the cold, black fuselage, ready to deliver their silent, world-changing truth. Hazer landed the U-2 at McCoy Air Force Base in Orlando precisely as planned. The landing was, as always, a white-knuckle affair, guided by the precision commentary of the chase car driver until the aircraft settled onto its skid plate. Within minutes of the engine shutting down, the intense operational tempo shifted from flight line to photo lab. The film magazines were immediately unloaded and rushed by military courier jet to the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, in Washington, D.C., located in an unassuming building known as Building 213. The analysis team at NPIC, led by analysts like Dino Brugioni, worked under a cloak of secrecy and intense pressure. The sheer quantity of film was immense. Thousands of frames, each one a high-resolution, 18-inch negative. The film went through a rapid chemical development process, emerging as long strips of photographic paper known as contact prints. The analysts, armed with magnifying glasses, light tables, and high-powered stereoscopes, began their painstaking frame-by-frame review of the images captured over Pinar del Rio. Initially, the images confirmed what the low-level flights had already suggested: a massive, organized Soviet military presence. They clearly showed vast troop encampments, supply depots, and the already identified defensive SA-2 sites. The analysts worked methodically, comparing the new images to their extensive library of Soviet equipment templates. Then, a single photograph, a clear shot of a clearing near the village of San Cristobal, stopped the process cold. The details were chillingly clear. The U-2's 73-inch lens, operating at its peak potential, had captured unmistakable evidence of an R 12 medium-range ballistic missile (MRBM) site. The photograph distinctly showed the 6 characteristic geometric patterns for missile-ready tents, a clearly visible launch control bunker, and, most damningly, 2 long, cylindrical canvas-covered trailers parked nearby. The size, shape, and overall configuration precisely matched the intelligence specifications for the R-12 missile, which had a range of 1,100 nautical miles, placing cities like Washington, D.C. and New York directly under a nuclear threat. The subsequent frames only amplified the discovery. They revealed the construction of 4 separate MRBM launch sites in the San Cristobal area alone, with evidence of further, even more dangerous intermediate-range ballistic missile (IRBM) sites being prepared at Sagua La Grande and Remedios. The IRBMs, specifically the R-14, CES-5, could strike targets 2,500 miles away, threatening almost the entire continental United States. The images were indisputable. They showed supply trucks, missile transporters, missile erectors, and the distinct outline of missile bodies under light camouflage netting. The Soviets had not just sent defensive weapons. They had installed an offensive first-strike nuclear capability on America's doorstep. The 72,000-foot Ghost had fulfilled its mission, transforming speculative whispers into concrete, terrifying reality. It was the morning of October 15, 1962. The contact prints and subsequent enlargements of the U-2 film were rushed to the office of McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor at the White House. The atmosphere was one of profound, paralyzing shock. The intelligence analysts, led by Dino Brugioni, laid the damning evidence out on a large table, using red grease pencils to circle and annotate the key features: launcher shelters, oxidizer bunkers, fencing, and the unmistakable outline of the R-12 missiles themselves. The analysts used clear plastic overlays to compare the Cuban sites directly to identical, known Soviet sites in the USSR. The congruence was terrifying. The moment of full realization hit Bundy and his deputy, Walt Rostow, with the force of a physical blow. The scale of the deceit was astonishing. Khrushchev had lied, Gromyko had lied, and the Soviet Union was now secretly pointing dozens of nuclear warheads at the United States from just 90 miles away. The analysis confirmed that these sites were rapidly approaching operational readiness. Some analysts estimated they could be fully armed and functional within a week, potentially less. The strategic balance of power, which had always been tilted in America's favor, was now brutally and instantly leveled. Bundy made the critical decision not to inform President Kennedy immediately. The president was in the middle of a campaign trip, and Bundy wanted to be absolutely certain of the interpretation before dropping a geopolitical thunderbolt on the commander-in-chief. He summoned Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, to review the evidence. McNamara, upon seeing the photographs, reportedly became quiet, his characteristic energy replaced by a cold, calculating assessment of the catastrophe. The photos were passed through the highest echelons of government. Every official who saw them had the same visceral reaction. The situation was no longer a theoretical Cold War threat, but an immediate existential danger. The photos provided the undeniable proof that precluded any possibility of diplomatic ambiguity or denial. The U-2, which the Soviets had mockingly dismissed and claimed to have neutralized, had just captured the evidence that would force the Soviet regime into a humiliating public retreat or plunge the world into nuclear war. The intelligence packet, a folder containing the clearest, most annotated images, was prepared for delivery to the president. Kennedy was due back in Washington, D.C. early on Tuesday, October 16th. The clock was ticking, not in days, but in hours before the weapons became fully operational. The silent image of the missile sites, captured by a lone pilot at the edge of the atmosphere, was about to launch the world into the most intense 2 weeks of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The intelligence package was delivered to President John F. Kennedy at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, October 16, 1962. The photographs, enlarged to show every telltale detail of the Soviet sites, were spread across his desk in the Oval Office. Kennedy's reaction was one of controlled fury and grim resolution. The lies of the Soviets had been exposed by the camera's objective lens, and the situation was infinitely more dangerous than anyone had publicly dared to imagine. Kennedy immediately convened a secret, ad hoc committee of his most trusted advisors, known informally as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. This group included his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and General Maxwell Taylor. The very first meeting was characterized by an immediate, terrifying division. The military leaders, still operating under the presumption of a necessary knockout blow, pressed hard for an immediate, massive airstrike against the missile sites, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. They argued that any delay would allow the missiles to become operational, threatening American cities. However, Robert McNamara and Robert Kennedy, supported by civilian advisors, countered this with a devastating realization. The photographs only showed the launchers, but the nuclear warheads, which had been shipped separately, might already be in Cuba, potentially mated to the missiles and ready to fire. An unannounced, conventional airstrike against the sites risked not only killing Soviet personnel, but triggering an immediate retaliatory nuclear strike against the U.S. from Cuba or a Soviet land grab in Berlin. The stakes were no longer about political face, but about the survival of Western civilization. The U-2's indisputable evidence provided ExComm with a precious, though finite, window of opportunity. The missile sites were not yet fully operational. This fact allowed the administration to reject the immediate, catastrophic military action and instead opt for a deliberate, escalating diplomatic and military response. For the next 7 days, ExComm debated in total secrecy, considering options ranging from a quiet diplomatic approach to a full-scale invasion. Finally, the consensus coalesced around a strategy of naval quarantine, a blockade to prevent any further offensive military material from reaching Cuba. This was a direct, public challenge to Moscow that avoided a direct act of war. On the evening of October 22, 1962, President Kennedy addressed the nation, publicly revealing the existence of the missile sites and announcing the quarantine. He used the U-2 photographs as his incontrovertible proof. The Soviets had laughed at the U-2, claiming it was an obsolete target. It was the U-2's photos that gave Kennedy the strategic initiative and the irrefutable evidence he needed to confront Moscow publicly, launching the world onto the dizzying precipice of the crisis. When news of President Kennedy's quarantine speech and the public display of the U-2 photographs reached Moscow, the reaction in the Kremlin was a furious mixture of shock, betrayal, and tactical realization. Nikita Khrushchev was reportedly stunned. He had banked on the missiles being fully operational before the Americans could gather definitive public proof. The U-2 had denied him this critical window of deniability. The high-altitude reconnaissance plane, the flying tank he had dismissed with such contempt just 2 years earlier, had effectively defeated his most audacious strategic gamble. The photographs stripped Khrushchev of any political maneuvering room. He could no longer claim the buildup was purely defensive, nor could he deny the presence of the missiles. The clarity of the U-2 images, subsequently reproduced in newspapers worldwide, served as the ultimate, undeniable evidence that he had been lying. This photographic evidence was the single most important factor that led to the Soviet Union's eventual concession. The immediate Soviet response was twofold: publicly a defiant condemnation of the illegal blockade and a continuance of the weapons construction in Cuba. Privately, however, Khrushchev realized the extent of the disaster. The U.S. was demanding the immediate removal of the missiles, and the alternative was a direct military confrontation that the Soviet Union, at that time, was ill-equipped to win in the Caribbean. The tension escalated to an almost unbearable degree on October 27, 1962, known as Black Saturday. During a mandatory, high-altitude reconnaissance mission over Cuba, an Air Force U-2 U-2 piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was shot down by a Soviet-operated SA-2 missile near Baines, Cuba. Major Anderson was killed instantly. The intelligence analyst's presumption of a U-2's safety at 72,000 feet was tragically proven false, confirming the Soviet improvements in radar and missile guidance systems. The loss of Anderson pushed both the U.S. military and the XCOM closer than ever to authorizing an immediate airstrike against the remaining missile sites. However, the photographic evidence already gathered by Hazer's mission proved its enduring value. The U.S. knew exactly where every missile site was, allowing for surgical planning rather than a panicked, blind attack. The ultimate resolution came through secret back-channel negotiations, culminating in Khrushchev's agreement to remove the missiles in exchange for a public American pledge not to invade Cuba, and a secret agreement to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The U-2's photos had started the crisis, and its second tragic flight, while claiming a pilot, only underscored the gravity of the situation, forcing a final, desperate diplomatic resolution before the world tipped into nuclear war. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis on October 28, 1962, secured the most fragile peace of the Cold War, and in that peace the U-2 Dragon Lady cemented its legendary, if controversial, place in history. The immediate consequence was the preservation of peace, largely because a single aircraft, flying at the edge of the atmosphere, had provided the irrefutable evidence that forced Khrushchev's hand and gave Kennedy the critical time needed for diplomatic negotiation. Without the U-2's clear, high-altitude photographs, the U.S. would have been forced to rely on vague intelligence, likely leading to an immediate, massive military response based on the worst-case scenario, a response that could have initiated World War III. The crisis underscored one absolute truth for both superpowers: reconnaissance was essential to survival. The U-2 had demonstrated that reliable, timely, and undeniable intelligence was the most crucial weapon in the nuclear age, preventing escalation by eliminating the fog of war. The shoot-down of Major Anderson, however, proved that the era of unchallenged overflight was definitively over. 72,000 feet was no longer a sanctuary. This dual lesson spurred a dramatic shift in both American and Soviet intelligence strategy. The U-2 itself underwent immediate, radical improvements, incorporating electronic countermeasures, ECM, and developing even higher flying variants, pushing its operational ceiling to 75,000 feet and beyond. Simultaneously, the U.S. poured massive resources into developing its next generation of strategic reconnaissance, the State Route 71 Blackbird, designed for speed and altitude that would make it virtually invulnerable, and, more significantly, the Corona satellite program. The crisis accelerated the shift from manned flight reconnaissance to automated, orbiting satellite systems. Satellites offered risk-free, continuous global surveillance, fundamentally changing the nature of espionage forever. For the Soviet Union, the humiliation of the U-2 photos led to a renewed, intense focus on closing the technological gap. They poured resources into advanced air defense systems and their own high-altitude, high-speed reconnaissance programs. Yet, despite being declared obsolete by the onset of the satellite age, the U-2 refused to retire. Its ability to be rapidly deployed to crisis spots, its precise maneuverability, and its unique optical systems, capable of capturing detail that satellites often missed, kept it in active service. It continued to fly vital missions over Vietnam, the Middle East, and countless other flashpoints. In an ironic twist of fate, the plane the Soviets once laughed at, the ghost that revealed their greatest deception, continued flying deep into the 21st century. The U-2's legacy is not just the history it recorded, but the nuclear war it prevented, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the Cold War was not a bomb, but a single, clear photograph taken from the silent edge of space.